Peace, everybody. It's Mutahana here with Beyond Clouds. So, this short video ran across my feed not long ago of an African American woman talking about the 1924 Racial Integrity Act. And she asked for Indians to come holler. So, on behalf of my grandmamas, I'm going to do just that in hopes of giving people more information and perhaps more like detailed or nuanced information to have you go and research further to get a more rounded perspective. So let's start with this nigga over here. So this crapwad Walter Plecker was a supreme a-hole who was a staunch white supremacist. He was the head of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Virginia. They came up with this Racial Integrity Act, which was solely to preserve the purity of whiteness. Now, because so much intermingling, whether consensual or forced, had taken place here in this land after these white folks came on through here and started terrorizing everybody. Since there was so much, blood mixture, God forbid, they were they were beside themselves that anyone besides actual white people were able to benefit from systems and societies in America who were not white folks. And so because of these mixtures, and because white people back then and obviously black people today were not very educated in the races that they had conjured in this whole colonized system, and all these ethnicities that were being created because of it. And so all these people were walking around passing as white folks, whether perceived, whether they really thought they were or if they didn't. And, white folks are being pissed off, and nobody more than this cat, Walter. And so they came about, they made up this act to filter all the posers, essentially. And so they came up with all these rules. So the woman in the video, it seemed to me she was most concerned about the word colored and about the 1/16th American Indian blood. So let's start with the word colored. For sure, colored back then was primarily used for African Americans or people who they could visually see, like they knew had some sort of African heritage. So, of course, because they weren't the brightest, that would have to do with coloring or with hair type or, with broad noses or full lips and stuff like that, as if other peoples didn't have those same things. But those are the things they will go on. So usually colored had to do with African Americans and people with obvious African heritage, but it wasn't only them. And yes, it did include Native Americans sometimes. Not because black people are the original Native Americans or the original people of this land. No, it all had to do with legalities and what these white folks essentially thought they were looking at. That's all it had to do with it. So that's, why the whole color thing. So if you think that if there was a whites only and a colored only water fountain, and black people couldn't drink at that water fountain, black being African American people or people with obvious African American lineage, if you think that they couldn't drink at these white fountains but Native Americans could, or Persians could, or Moroccans, the real Moors, could, you're, it's just not how it went. Colored people essentially was anybody who they deemed to be non-white. So that wording means nothing. And as I've said, or it means little, but I've said many, many times before, is folks need to, for real, study the United States federal censuses from 1790 and on. It is very accessible. Just go to census.gov and read it yourself, and you'll see how race and ethnicity has changed in this country, and it's always had to do with what benefits white people. The United States government, i.e. white supremacy, white patriarchy. That's what it is. Now, to the 1/16th American Indian blood that is mentioned in there. Again, I'm going to stress the 1924 Racial Integrity Act was solely about preserving white purity. That means that 1/16th blood was not of benefit to indigenous people. It had nothing to do with benefiting indigenous people. It had everything to do with benefiting whiteness. And so, I don't know, people look at that maybe and think that's some sort of proof that indigenous people who are saying now, like today, that they are indeed indigenous people, and folks are trying to disprove that, which is beyond weird to me. I mean, there's tons of evidence, tangible evidence, that you can go and see yourselves. But, I mean, if you really wanted to, but people are trying to use that, I guess, to say that indigenous people are not the actual people who have been here for millennia. That's not what that was for. What that was for was for people who had been absorbed into white society and had actually garnered like high positions, high statuses, and actually had some Native American blood. That was so their whiteness could be preserved. So much like George Schuler's book, that was about black versus whiteness, but how at the end of the book, all these people who are higher ups, like the president and all these people, it came out that they actually had black ancestry, like back generations ago. But when that was found out, it was like, oh, it's okay to have that much blood though. We still white. That is exactly what that portion of the Integrity Act is about. It has nothing to do with indigenous people, and it for sure has no type of validity that indigenous people are not indigenous people, and that African Americans are not the true people of this land. It's just not. Now, there are lots of us who do have indigenous ancestry, but that ain't everybody. And that does not mean that we somehow were the originators. No. That's not how it goes. So let's take this a little step further still. So what does 1/16th Indian blood actually mean? 1/16 blood. If you have 1/16 Native American blood, that means that you had one full-blooded great great grandparent. So 4 generations ago, or if it is being referred to you, or to make it more, into what I'm talking about here, the person that Plecker and them were trying to get a hold of to prove that they weren't actually white people and that they should not be reaping the benefits of white people in this country, that would be the 5th generation from that great great grandparent, which brings it to 1/16. So let's put that in perspective. The Revolutionary War, which was the war that the colonizers, the new colonizers here in this land, fought against Britain in order to secede, in order to become their own nation. Of course, they were only able to become a nation because of Morocco. Not Moors, not black Moors. The actual Moroccans, the nation of Morocco. It's only because they co-signed it. That had to be done, because when a nation is created, another nation has to sort of back you up, co-sign. So anyway, the Revolutionary War, which started in 1775, but it actually went on to like around 1783. And it ended with the Treaty of Paris, which stole 13 colonies from 13 colonies of land, I should say, from indigenous people. So 1783. For the person that Plecker and Virginia were going after, for them to have had a great great grandparent from back then, that time would have been somewhere around 1804 to 1824, because a generation is roughly 20 to 25 years, 20 to 30 years, something like that. So that would take, that great great grandparent would have been born somewhere around 1804 to 1824 ish. That is like roughly 20 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. So even though the Integrity Act was created in 1924, that 1/16 would have been from way back then. Okay? So to put that in perspective, 20 years is not a long time. I'm sure most of the people who are looking at this right now can look at 20 years back at 20 years ago and feel like it was a year ago. It's not a long time. So what was happening at that time with the Native Americans, related to white folks and colonizers here in this country? So I know that there is this very popular urban legend among African Americans that white folks had to go to Africa and get Africans to be slaves, because apparently they're just made to be slaves, and the Native Americans, they were too weak, they were dying off and everything, they couldn't be slaves, so they had to go and get our people. I can't tell you how many times I done heard that ridiculous ass claim, and I've even heard it among PhDs in college settings. It's dumb. It's not true. There's a great book that you can read to get more information if you like. But I say that to say, indigenous people weren't just sitting on their asses over in the corners, woe is me, Lord, please, Lord Jesus, come and help me. No, that's not what they were doing. They were fighting back. And a lot of them were kicking ass. So there were a whole lot of battles going on. Tecumseh and his brother with their pan-tribal movements, and all sorts of things happening where they were fighting back. Of course, America is a demon that nobody knew the likes of back then and even today. And so they ended up winning, but it was all through violence. it was all through, you know, trickery and forcing people into corners and, you know, forcing them to do all sorts of things just in order to survive. It wasn't only black folks going through shit here in this country at the hands of white people. I know folks like to think that so for some reason, but it's just not true. And black horrors and traumas do not trump everybody else's, or do not, let me not use that word, trump, do not override everybody else's traumas and stuff that has happened at the hands of this white supremacist government. And so all these things were happening at that time. But by 1830 is when the Indian Removal Act was set into play. And, you know, we know about that, the Trail of Tears, and all sorts of things were happening. But bringing it back to that 1/16th, one full-blooded Native American great-great-grandparent, who do you think that was? Who do you think that was? That sounds a whole lot to me. To me, that sounds a whole lot like fucking rape. That's what that sounds like to me. That sounds to me that these people who Plecker and Virginia were saying, no, they're right, had a great-great-grandmama who was likely raped by some white soldier, some white farmer, somebody, or even forced or coerced into a situation where survival. See, people don't like to look at the nuances of human reality and of history. We ain't talking about 2025, where people can go and get government assistance and get food stamps or get some sort of Medicaid and help and things of that nature, or where women could just go on out and get a job and take care of themselves. Or none of that was happening back then. None of that was happening. There was all sorts of nuance entailed in the forced removal, the forced erasure of indigenous people. Many indigenous nations back then were a matriarchy. And so in order for the U.S. government to get their claws in and get their hands on the land and to break the people and all those sorts of things, they went after the women. So what do you think? So people look at stuff like that and think that somehow it's proof of some sort of modern indigenous trickery and some sort of proof that they are not truly who they say they are. And again, in this disregard that, I don't know what, black people are the originators of this land. It's just not so. It's not so. And so that's where that 1/16th blood would have likely come from. Of course, there were instances where people, I would say, consensually have gotten into relationships, you know, indigenous people with white people, indigenous people with black people, whatever the case is. And there were starting to be, you know, other ethnicities, people here and there, you know, coming here to this land. But, and again, this whole thing of race is bullshit. So, you know, when you talk about like Irish people who are coming over, or, you know, Germans, Scandinavians, whomever, Italians, you know, eventually, they over time became white, but they ain't who they were at first. So, I mean, I just say all this because this video is getting longer. I just say all this to say Your conclusion is wrong. And I say that respectfully, because I know people be getting in their feelings, and folks will probably be all in my comments saying all kind of crazy stuff, which makes no sense. But that's not what was happening there. That 1/16th had nothing to do with benefiting indigenous people. It was solely to preserve the whiteness of people who had a little tinge of Native American blood, but also it was more to continue the white tradition of stealing land, stealing human rights, stealing sovereignty from indigenous people. It actually doesn't back the claims that a lot of African Americans have regarding indigenous people. It actually backs what indigenous people say. And let me say this. As an Afro-Indigenous person, which makes me part Indigenous, part African American, I came up among African American people. I would say this. I don't really think that this primarily is a racial problem. I know there are a lot of indigenous people who are frustrated with this whole thing, and they're fighting back with terms like pretendian and all this kind of stuff. Pine cone, which I think that shit sucks. As much as I think it sucks for the African Americans who come in after indigenous people. But I don't think it's I don't really think it's a racial issue. I think it's an appropriation issue. In the same way the African Americans were like coming for Rachel Dolezal and other people who made, especially when the reparations start flowing at some point, folks gonna be coming out the woodwork, and African Americans gonna be fucking up in arms, because they're already up in arms. I know a whole lot of y'all looking at me right now fuming because this little light-skinned girl talking all this shit. So take that same energy and try to understand where indigenous people are coming from, who believe, and to me, I think has a whole lot of validity, who believe that they need to stand up and fight back. Because it's true. Too many of y'all do not have indigenous heritage. And it's not just because of some DNA thing, because I hear some indigenous people say, get your DNA. Y'all don't know nothing of what you're talking about. That ain't how DNA works. It's not how DNA works. And I could do something deeper on that later if you want. But so many of you truly are not indigenous. You're not. And saying that your grandmama, so many grandmamas talked about being Indian, it seems. Your grandmama saying something don't mean anything. And again, I don't say that disrespectfully. I'm saying that because I grew up among African Americans. I'm over 50 years old. My ear been to the streets for a very, very long time. And so I've heard plenty of people say, talk about the baby hair, the hair like their edges, they call them now, how their baby hair got a little bit straight. Everything else afro in the mug, but the little edges got some little straightness to it, or they may have a little, waviness to their hair, or even if it's straight out, just straight. They'll say, oh, this because we got Indian blood. They don't know who their second great grandmama is, but they know they're Indian. And so I'm always like, perhaps that came from some white relative, or perhaps your African lineage is actually from Eritrea or something like that. Maybe you got some Arab in here somewhere, some Semitic or whatever. You know what I'm saying? It can be all kinds of things, but in the African American community, that's not how it is. And then over time, somehow, they just started saying all Black people have indigenous heritage. And it's just not true. What I notice about people across the board, whomever they are, whatever their nationality is, what I notice is that anything that sounds good to somebody, they run with it. But if it's something that don't fit into their own personal narrative or their own personal whatever they want to believe, they toss it to the side. Neither one of those do they actually research. They just think it's true, and so it's true. And they will fight tooth and nail to try to make other people believe it. So, but that's not called evidence. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. She asked for Indian to speak up. I'm speaking up. So there you go.